Hannah Blake appeared to be a devoted wife, quietly preparing for motherhood, while Daniel Blake was the hard-working husband building a life for their growing family. But when Daniel was found murdered in his garage, and just 2 days later, Hannah married his wealthy stepfather, Charles Blake, the illusion of a happy home shattered. What looked like grief soon twisted into suspicion, revealing a chilling conspiracy built on betrayal, greed, and the darkest kind of love. Hannah and Daniel Blake lived in a small, peaceful town in Indiana where neighbors waved from across driveways and garage doors rarely needed locking. Their marriage, at least to outsiders, seemed close to perfect. They had been together for 5 years and were known as the kind of couple that hosted backyard barbecues and volunteered for community fundraisers. Daniel, 32, was a quiet, reliable man who worked long hours as a software engineer. He had a stable job at a tech firm in the city and a calm presence that put people at ease. Hannah, 29, worked as a school nurse and was 6 months pregnant with their first child. Her glowing smile and warm nature made her popular among the children she cared for and the teachers she worked alongside. They were the type of couple people envied, not flashy, not loud, just steady, kind, and tightly bonded. But sometimes the strongest-looking structures can conceal the deepest cracks. Daniel had a close relationship with his family, particularly his stepfather, Charles Blake. Charles was an older, charismatic man in his late 50s with a commanding voice and an expensive taste in everything from suits to wine. After Daniel's biological father died when he was just 12, Charles had stepped in as a father figure, eventually marrying Daniel's mother and becoming deeply involved in Daniel's upbringing. Many described Charles as generous and wise, a man who mentored young professionals and was respected in both business and social circles. But those who knew him more intimately often noted that his generosity came with strings attached. Charles was used to being in control, and he didn't take kindly to being challenged. Hannah had always been cautious around Charles. From the start, she felt something off about him. He had a way of making everything seem like it was his idea, even when it wasn't. When she and Daniel decided to buy their house, Charles insisted on co-signing the mortgage, claiming it would help them secure better interest rates. When they chose the hospital for Hannah's prenatal care, Charles suggested a private clinic he had connections with, and Daniel had agreed without hesitation. Every major decision in their life seemed to have Charles's fingerprints on it. Hannah quietly resented how much influence he had, but Daniel didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did and just didn't care. As Hannah's pregnancy progressed, the tension between her and Charles deepened. He often showed up unannounced at their home, bringing gifts for the baby and offering unsolicited advice. Sometimes he stayed too long or commented on things that made Hannah uncomfortable, how she was dressing, what she was eating, even how much time Daniel was spending away from home. Daniel brushed off her concerns, saying Charles just wanted to help. Hannah didn't argue. She figured once the baby arrived, things would change. They always do, she thought. It was late autumn when things took a dark turn. On a chilly Wednesday morning in November, Hannah received a call that shattered her world. Daniel had been found dead in the garage of their home, 2 gunshot wounds to the chest. He had returned home from work the previous night, but he never made it inside the house. A neighbor had noticed the garage door slightly open and went to check. What they found sent shockwaves through the community. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle. No blood anywhere but near the body. It was as if the killer had walked in and out without leaving a single trace. The police were immediately involved. They cordoned off the property, brought in forensic teams, and questioned neighbors and family members. Hannah was staying with her sister that night and had an airtight alibi. She had gone to visit her niece, stayed the night, and only returned home the next morning to find squad cars outside and yellow tape wrapped around her home. She collapsed on the front lawn when she saw Daniel's body being wheeled into an ambulance. Officers tried to comfort her, but her sobs echoed through the street, drawing neighbors from their homes and bringing the small town to a stunned silence. News of Daniel's death spread quickly. The media descended upon the neighborhood, asking questions no one had answers to. Who would want to hurt Daniel? Why wasn't anything stolen? Was it a robbery gone wrong or something else entirely? The police promised a thorough investigation, but behind the scenes, they were stumped. Nothing about the crime scene made sense. The house's alarm system hadn't been triggered. There were no strange fingerprints, no security footage of a break-in, and no witnesses. The garage had only one entrance, and it had been locked from the inside. People began speculating. Maybe it was a business deal gone wrong, though Daniel's job in tech didn't seem dangerous. Maybe it was random, maybe he saw something he shouldn't have. As days passed with no arrests, the mystery only deepened. But while the town mourned, something else was happening behind closed doors, something no one could have predicted. Just 2 days after Daniel's funeral, a clerk at the county courthouse processed a new marriage license. Hannah Blake was listed as the bride, and the groom, Charles Blake, her late husband's stepfather. The whispers started immediately. The shock of Hannah's sudden marriage to Charles Blake spread like wildfire. In a quiet community already shaken by Daniel's mysterious death, this bizarre twist was almost too much to comprehend. People who had once offered casseroles and condolences began to turn their backs. Rumors circulated in grocery store aisles and church parking lots. Some believed Hannah had lost her mind from grief. Others were certain there was something darker at play. Why would a woman marry her father-in-law just 2 days after her husband's funeral? The police, already under pressure for failing to make progress in Daniel's case, took notice of the marriage immediately. It wasn't just scandalous, it changed everything. Until now, Hannah had been seen as a grieving widow, a victim left behind. But now investigators began to reconsider her role. The timeline didn't add up. How could she move on so quickly unless she hadn't been grieving at all? Suddenly, her alibi, her tears, and her performance at the funeral all felt suspicious. Despite the questions swirling around her, Hannah didn't offer any public explanation. She withdrew from the world, refusing interviews, cutting off old friends, and deleting social media. Her marriage to Charles was done quietly in a private courthouse ceremony. No guests, no announcement, no honeymoon. They returned to the same house where Daniel had been murdered and carried on as if nothing had happened. Detectives revisited the crime scene, going over every detail with fresh eyes. They re-examined phone records, security footage, and autopsy reports. The murder had been too clean. 2 shots, close range, no defensive wounds. The killer had known what they were doing. The house's alarm system had not been triggered, which meant one of 2 things. Either the killer had a code or the system had been disabled from the inside. That made it likely that Daniel had known his killer, or at the very least, that someone inside the house had played a part. As suspicion mounted, the case was quietly shifted to the Homicide Division's Special Crimes Unit, which focused on murders with unusual circumstances. They began to dig into Charles's background, hoping to find any link between him and the night of the murder. On the surface, Charles was clean. A retired corporate executive with no criminal record, no debt, and a well-respected reputation. But financial records told a more interesting story. 1 week before Daniel's death, Charles had made a large wire transfer, $50,000, to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The account was listed under an alias with no clear connection to any family member or business deal. It was unusual for someone with no ongoing business interests to move that kind of money so discreetly. Investigators flagged it immediately. They believed the money may have been a payment, a retainer for something illicit. The discovery led to more questions. If Charles had paid someone, who had he paid and why? Investigators dug into his phone records and emails. Most seemed normal work-related messages, family check-ins, appointments, but then a pattern emerged. In the months leading up to Daniel's death, Charles had been communicating regularly with a man named Matthew Cross, a former military contractor with a checkered past. Cross had no business being in Charles's life. He wasn't a friend, family member, or co-worker. He wasn't even local. Cross had a history of working in security operations overseas. He had done time in the Middle East and South America, working for private firms on assignments that were never fully disclosed. After leaving the industry, he had vanished from most digital records, no social media, no business listings, no public trace. But his name had come up in a few federal investigations involving offshore transactions and unlicensed surveillance equipment. Detectives began to believe that Daniel's death may not have been spontaneous or personal. It might have been a contract killing ordered by someone close to him and carried out by a professional. And if Charles was the one who made the payment, what did that say about Hannah? At the same time, investigators noticed something even more concerning. In Daniel's life insurance documents, Hannah was listed as the sole beneficiary of a $1.2 million policy. But just before his death, Daniel had amended the policy to include a clause, in the event of Hannah's death, all funds would go to Charles. This meant that Charles stood to gain financially, not just through inheritance, but also through the life insurance policy, as long as he had a legal connection to Hannah. In the days after the wedding, Hannah transferred control of all financial accounts and property deeds to joint ownership with Charles. It was a rapid reshuffling of assets, and it happened too quickly to be explained away by grief or desperation. Detectives believed this wasn't a random tragedy or a whirlwind romance. It was a plan that had been in motion for months. They just needed proof. The problem was, both Hannah and Charles had covered their tracks well. There were no obvious digital trails linking them to Matthew Cross, and no murder weapon had been recovered. Without concrete evidence, the case couldn't move forward. The investigation stalled. But then, weeks later, a mysterious package arrived at the local police department. It was postmarked from an unknown address and contained only a flash drive. On it was a single audio file. And what it revealed would shatter everything. The anonymous package sent to the police department came in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a USB flash drive and a brief note that simply said, "Listen carefully." Investigators inserted the drive into a secure system and played the audio file. What they heard changed the course of the investigation instantly. It was a recorded phone conversation between two people, a man and a woman, both speaking cautiously. The audio was slightly distorted but clear enough to identify the voices with digital enhancement. The man was Matthew Cross, the former military contractor. The woman was Hannah Blake. In the recording, Hannah discussed Daniel's routines, when he usually came home, how he always parked in the garage, what time she'd be away. She made it sound casual, but to detectives, it was a roadmap for murder. She mentioned needing everything to look like an accident or a robbery gone wrong. Her tone was cold, calm, deliberate. At one point, she even asked if it could be done without blood getting into the house. That single line sent chills down the backs of the officers listening. There was no longer room for doubt. This wasn't a grieving widow who had found comfort in her father-in-law. This was a premeditated murder for profit. The audio evidence was forwarded to forensic teams for authentication. And within days, they confirmed the voices matched voice prints from Hannah's police interviews and public speeches. She had underestimated the reach of technology and had made the mistake of using a regular phone line, which had likely been tapped or recorded by someone on the inside. Investigators now had the piece they needed to connect Hannah directly to the killing, but they still didn't know who had sent the flash drive or why. Around the same time, a second piece of evidence surfaced, this time from an unexpected source. A former employee of Charles Blake came forward, claiming he had once been asked to install a hidden safe in Charles's home office. The employee, a contractor, said Charles was secretive about the contents but had mentioned needing a place to secure sensitive materials. Acting on this tip, detectives secured a warrant and returned to the Blake residence. The search was methodical. Inside the office, investigators found a small concealed panel behind a bookshelf. It took hours to access, but when they finally opened it, they discovered a locked steel case. Inside were several burner phones, foreign currency, a loaded pistol, and a printed document and unsigned contract for security consulting services addressed to Matthew Cross. The document outlined a vague agreement for surveillance, protection, and intervention if required, with a listed payment of $50,000 matching the transfer made from Charles's account. Everything was falling into place. The money trail, the contract, the phone calls, the suspicious marriage, it all pointed to one horrifying truth. Daniel Blake had been murdered in a carefully orchestrated plot by the two people closest to him. Hannah and Charles had not just conspired together, they had executed a flawless plan to remove Daniel from the picture and take control of his assets and legacy. But they had made one critical mistake: they believed no one would question them. In their arrogance they had let small cracks appear, and those cracks had grown wide enough for the truth to break through. The police moved quickly to arrest both Hannah and Charles. They coordinated the arrests to happen simultaneously to prevent either one from warning the other. Charles was taken into custody at a private golf club where he had been meeting with a financial advisor. Hannah was arrested at a prenatal checkup. Both were charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice. The news spread rapidly, stunning the community that had once pitied Hannah and respected Charles. During the initial interrogations, neither of them spoke. They invoked their right to remain silent and waited for their attorneys, but the evidence was overwhelming. Forensic teams matched the bullets found in Daniel S.'s body to the gun found in Charles S.'s hidden safe. Transaction records showed the financial transfers. Phone records, voice analysis, and the burner phones connected the final dots. The prosecution had built a rock-solid case, and they were confident it would hold up in court. As the trial date approached, more details began to surface. Investigators uncovered emails between Hannah and a friend from college that hinted at an unhappy marriage and a secret affair. The friend testified that Hannah had often complained about feeling trapped and had spoken cryptically about a future where she could finally breathe. Combined with the financial incentives, life insurance, property, and the estate, it painted a clear picture of motive. Public opinion turned quickly and sharply. The same people who had once lit candles for Daniel were now demanding justice. Online forums, talk shows, and podcasts dissected every detail. People speculated about when the affair between Hannah and Charles had truly started. Some believed it had been going on for years. Others suspected that Charles had manipulated Hannah, preying on her isolation during pregnancy. But in the eyes of the law, it didn't matter who had the stronger influence. Both had plotted and executed a murder, and both would be held accountable. The trial promised to be one of the most explosive the county had ever seen. Prosecutors were prepared to reveal the full extent of the conspiracy, down to the last dollar and final bullet. The story was no longer about a woman grieving her husband. It was about two people who had taken a life to gain everything and who were about to lose it all. The courtroom was packed as pretrial hearings began, with reporters filing in early and townspeople whispering in the gallery. The prosecution presented their evidence in careful detail. The audio recordings, the shell casings matched to the gun found in Charles's safe, the offshore payment, and the burner phones. Each piece fit together like a puzzle, illustrating a methodical plan to defraud Daniel's estate and life insurance company. Hannah and Charles sat at the defense table, expressionless, flanked by their lawyers. The mood was tense. Not far from them sat the lead detective who had pieced the investigation together, steeling himself for the rest of the trial. While media coverage ramped up, investigators continued digging into the couple's personal histories to discover possible motives beyond money. They explored Daniel's relationship with Charles, Hannah's state of mind, the affair, and whether either had expressed doubt or guilt afterward. They interviewed colleagues, old friends, teachers, and family members. A psychiatrist who had known Hannah observed that she had long struggled with an intense fear of being controlled, describing her as someone who felt trapped in roles she never chose. Friends spoke of her exhaustion in the months leading up to the crime, noting that she seemed increasingly drained. But the prosecution maintained that this emotional fatigue had nothing to do with murder. This was premeditation, pure and simple. One turning point came when digital forensic specialists recovered deleted text messages from one of Charles' burner phones. In them, Charles had texted cross instructions after the murder saying "package delivered" and "clean up next." He even included a photo of Daniel S.'s lifeless body in the garage from an overhead security camera. This was damning evidence Charles had not just planned the killing, but was monitoring it, celebrating it, and orchestrating the aftermath. Defense attorneys argued that the messages were taken out of context, claiming Charles had been part of an intelligence role for a private firm and that the text messages had legitimate security-related purposes. They portrayed Charles as a grieving stepfather who had tried to help Hannah cope with the worst moment of her life. They questioned the reliability of the anonymous flash drive and suggested it could have been planted. But jurors had heard about the offshore payment, the contract, and the recording. The accumulation of evidence made doubt more difficult to maintain. In parallel, investigators were working to find the person behind the flash drive tip-off. They traced the postmark to a small town north of Indiana's state border. Surveillance footage from the post office revealed a mid-aged woman short, wearing a trench coat, dropping the envelope in the mailbox. No one recognized her. But mail carriers adjacent to the location recalled overhearing a phone call from the woman, mentioning the truth must come out. While her identity remained unconfirmed, detectives theorized she might have been a member of the security team or someone who stumbled upon the burner phones and the audio recordings. Her motive may have been conscience or fear. As the trial edged forward, tensions escalated when Hannah unexpectedly gave birth in jail. Behind bars, she endured the harsh reality of prison motherhood, a baby placed in foster care with her grandparents' regular but fleeting visits through glass panels, and the heavy weight of loss and regret. The image of a newborn separated from her mother gripped public attention and gave new layers to the case. The prosecution argued that Hannah had used the pregnancy as distraction, but jurors were moved by her plight. Questions spread. Could she have been coaxed into the crime, or did she cross a moral line never to be returned from? Prosecutors answered by highlighting the birth's timing. They pointed out that the marriage was arranged just days after Daniel's death and before news of the pregnancy was public. They stressed how the asset transfers from Daniel's estate to Charles and Hannah had been finalized days before the baby's arrival. The birth, they argued, had no bearing on the conspiracy. It was just another chapter in the plan. Money had been the motivator all along. One emotional moment arrived when Daniel's sister provided a victim impact statement. She spoke of her brother's gentle kindness, his dreams of fatherhood, and how he had built a life to protect them all. She recalled the last time she saw him, laughing at a Sunday lunch. Her voice cracked as she described the moment she learned of his death and how the shock had fractured the entire family. Looking at Hannah and Charles, she asked, "How could you take all we had away in a single breath?" Her statement lifted the tragedy into the courtroom's heart. During closing arguments, prosecutors summarized the case with precision: the hired killer, the conspiracy, the contract, the degraded moral code of two people consumed by greed. They spoke of betrayal, manipulation, and the sanctity of trust violated. Defense lawyers countered with claims of emotional instability, coercion, influence, and argued that no jury should convict someone based on a flash drive and offshore accounts. They appealed to mercy, especially given the newborn baby, but jurors remained silent, attentive. After days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty on all counts. Hannah and Charles were both sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During sentencing, even the defense attorney admitted they had a strong case and asked only for mercy due to the baby. The judge imposed the harshest sentence available, noting the premeditated nature of the crime, the cruelty of betrayal, and the long-lasting destruction inflicted on Daniel's family and unborn child. As the couple was led away, Hannah held a fragile photograph of her newborn daughter, the only physical link she had to hope, future, and sorrow. Charles stared straight ahead, defiance in his eyes, masking the emptiness beneath. The gallery held its breath as the gavel struck, sealing the fate of two people once seen as pillars of the community. After the trial, investigators returned to the Blake home one last time. It had been cleared, emptied, and sold to new owners. The memory of what happened there would forever linger. The blonde hair of the new owner's toddler chattered with delight in the backyard, a stark contrast to the ghost that once occupied the space. For those who watched the case, the lesson was clear: love and family can hide the darkest secrets, and sometimes those closest to you are the ones most capable of betrayal. The case remains a cautionary tale told in true crime podcasts, court dockets, documentaries like this one, and in hushed conversations where people still ask, how well do we really know the ones we love? Long after the courtroom lights dimmed and the media frenzy died down, the aftermath of the Blake murder case continued to ripple through the small Indiana town like a wound that refused to heal. Though Hannah and Charles Blake were both serving life sentences, the echoes of their crime lingered in every corner of the community, from the school where Hannah once worked to the tech firm where Daniel had built his career to the quiet street where their home now sat under new ownership. The town that once saw the couple as wholesome and respectable had been forced to reckon with an uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't always arrive in shadows. Sometimes it smiles, hosts baby showers, and bakes casseroles. The case had become a cautionary tale, dissected in true crime forums, podcasts, and televised specials. Yet, while outsiders debated the psychology of betrayal and the anatomy of greed, those closest to the story were left grappling with a different kind of reality. Daniel's mother, who had lost both a son and a husband in one chilling conspiracy, moved away shortly after the trial, unable to bear the weight of her shattered family. She left behind the house she had lived in for nearly 3 decades, selling it to strangers and erasing traces of her past one box at a time. Daniel's sister, who had given the heartbreaking victim impact statement during sentencing, became the legal guardian of his infant daughter. The child, now a toddler, was thriving in a quiet home far away from the whispers and stares. She bore a striking resemblance to Daniel, with the same deep-set eyes and quiet smile. She would grow up hearing only small pieces of the truth, shielded as long as possible from the horrifying legacy left behind by her mother and step-grandfather. But one day, the full story would be hers to inherit, and her guardians prayed she would be strong enough to face it. Inside prison walls, Hannah's life had taken a strange shape. She kept mostly to herself, her once polished appearance replaced by the blank uniform of a convicted felon. Inmates whispered about her case, often speculating whether she felt remorse or had convinced herself she was the victim. She rarely spoke during group therapy sessions, but clung tightly to the faded photograph of her daughter, small printed image worn at the corners. It was the only possession she cherished. Staff reported she would often sit quietly at night, staring at the photo as though trying to will herself back to the version of her life where everything had not yet gone so horribly wrong. Charles, on the other hand, remained cold and calculating. He had built a network of influence within the prison, using his past wealth and charisma to command a subtle kind of respect. Some guards said he walked the halls like he still believed he was untouchable. He never once expressed regret, never asked for leniency, and never spoke of Daniel. He had compartmentalized his crime, as he had likely done with countless decisions in his business life, reducing the murder of his stepson to a simple matter of gain and loss. But even in his carefully controlled world behind bars, whispers followed him. He was known as the father-in-law, a nickname soaked in irony and dread. In a final investigative report released 1 year after the sentencing, new details were made public. The anonymous sender of the flash drive had been identified as a former associate of Matthew Cross, the military contractor turned hitman. She had worked as a communications analyst during their time in private security, and had discovered the audio files after gaining access to his encrypted cloud server following his death in a suspicious car crash. Fearing she might be targeted next, she chose anonymity but sent the files to the authorities, hoping it would bring justice. Her action had tipped the scales and turned an unsolved murder into a closed case. Matthew Cross's death remained unsolved, with speculation that Charles may have ordered his silence once the heat turned up. The theory was never confirmed, and with Charles in prison for life, the case grew cold again. What was certain, though, was that Cross had been hired, paid, and utilized to carry out a professional assassination on a man who posed no threat except standing in the way of greed. The Blake murder case had started as a tragedy, spiraled into a scandal, and ended in a courtroom where the ugliest truths of human nature were laid bare. It wasn't just about a woman who married her father-in-law 2 days after her husband was murdered. It was about the erosion of trust, the corrosive pull of money, and how love can be faked with enough calculation. It was about a man who believed he could orchestrate everything, even life and death, if the numbers lined up. Though the case was closed, the questions remained. How could two people hide such monstrous intentions under the mask of family? Why did no one see the warning signs? And would the child born of such a grim chapter ever truly be free of its shadow? To this day, the Blake case remains a point of reflection for investigators, psychologists, and everyday people. It serves as a haunting reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not always strangers lurking in dark alleys, but those who smile across dinner tables, whisper promises behind closed doors, and pretend to love while plotting destruction. And in the end, Daniel Blake was not just a victim of murder, he was a victim of betrayal at the deepest level, taken by the two people who should have protected him most.